Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adam Bittner, digital sports producer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. It is Thursday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I am here back with Paul Zeise for our weekly Zeise is Right video, talking about all things Pittsburgh sports with our esteemed Post-Gazette sports columnist. Paul, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing today?
I'm great. The weather's getting nice, Paul. I can go out and walk on the Montour Trail every day, get off my duff, you know.
No, I think it's good. I mean, I think great weather puts people in better moods, and that's always a good thing.
Indeed, and obviously we're still in the middle of free agency. Paul, that's the first topic I want to get to with you is Devin White is now requesting a trade from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He was a guy who was on the Steelers' radar when they ended up drafting Devin Bush, trading up to draft Devin Bush at number 10 a few years ago. Now he wants out of Tampa Bay, or at the same time the Steelers are moving on from Devin Bush. Some people are saying that, hey, the Steelers should trade for him. They have this needed at middle linebacker. Devin White won a Super Bowl with Tampa Bay, obviously, a couple of years ago. Paul, what do you make of whether the Steelers should trade for this guy or not?
Well, I mean, if you can tell me what it's going to cost to get him, I mean, that obviously is the question. I mean, they should trade for a lot of guys, right? But at the end of the day, what's it going to cost to get him? And I think that's probably going to be prohibitive for the Steelers. They're not going to give up what it's going to take to be able to trade for him. I think he's a great player, obviously. I think he's a guy who probably is a little overrated, though. He does show up on impact plays and splash plays and everything else. But if you read anything about him, there's a lot of routine plays that he doesn't make. That's not the profile of somebody you want to give up a lion's share or a boatload for to try and get. So at the end of the day, it's a great topic because, there's been a lot of people over the course of the last, 4, 5, 6 years that have talked about how the Steelers got the wrong Devin. But I don't know that they're going to be able to pull it off, number one. And number two, I don't know that they really would want to pull it off because I think they feel pretty good now, at least, about what they have at inside linebacker. They probably need to add one more, but I don't know that they need to add a superstar.
Yeah, well, and what's crazy, Paul, is I was looking at the stats. I obviously do our Pro Football Focus grades post every week during the season, and I dabble in it, during the free agency and draft seasons. And Devin White actually had a worse Pro Football Focus score than Devin Bush and Robert Spillane, who were two guys that the Steelers have already decided to move on from this offseason, obviously going toward Landon Roberts, Cole Holcomb, bringing those guys in. How much stock do you put in that, Paul? I mean, Pro Football Focus grades aren't everything, but they're not nothing, right? And I think that paints a pretty damning picture of, maybe what kind of player Devin White actually is.
Well, again, I mean, I think that jives really with what I've said. He makes the splash plays and he shows up, 4, 5, 6, 8 times, even 7 times, maybe 6, 7 times or whatever during a game. But he also misses a lot of plays that he's supposed to make. And, at the end of the day, the Pro Football Focus, I'm not a big guy about, but I don't think, like you said, I don't think it's meaningless. And I think what they try and grade is how many of the plays you're supposed to make do you make? Like basically the baseline for an average player. These are these are the plays you're supposed to make. How many of them do you make? And he apparently doesn't make nearly as many as it seems for all of the, plays that he makes where, blasts through the line and blows somebody up in the backfield or, runs somebody down, makes a big sack or whatever. There's a lot of routine plays where guys run right past him that he's supposed to make. And also in coverage. So I'm not surprised. This is actually one where now I am surprised that his numbers are worse than Devin Bush and Robert Spillane. I would have to see, how that all grades out, but I'm not surprised that his numbers are less than probably what you would think given the hype that the guy gets, because everything I've read about him, and of course, this is going back the last couple of years because people kept talking about him being the great, the Devin that the Steelers needed to have and they don't have. I've thought he's been very overrated, to be honest, over the last couple of years. Devin White, I mean. Devin Bush hasn't been overrated because he's not been rated. I mean, but at the end of the day, I've always thought Devin White is one of those guys whose splash plays blind people to really the kind of player that he actually is.
Yeah, I think with the Pro Football Focus scores, a lot of people get caught up in saying, "Oh, is this guy really better than this guy?" and like kind of stacking players up next to each other. I think the big picture is the important thing. It doesn't really matter whether he was better or worse than Devin Bush or Robert Spillane. It matters, like you said, whether he was making plays consistently. And I think that's where the doubt in him creeps in terms of the numbers, especially because you'd be adding him for like a year, A, and B, he wants a new contract and he probably wants to get paid like a Super Bowl champion. Paul, do you think, how much does the Super Bowl champion label, maybe contribute to being overrated or people's perception of a player being maybe more solid than he is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably, and not just that, Adam, the Super Bowl is a big platform. And he played really, really well in that year that they won the Super Bowl. Those stretch of playoff games, he made a lot of big plays over, 3 games or whatever it was. And that obviously is probably the most that a lot of people watched him or a lot of people saw him. Because let's face it, if you're not a Tampa fan or you're not somebody that watches a lot of NFL outside of your favorite team, how many Tampa games you see in a year? There's a couple on Sunday Night Football, a couple on Monday Night Football, or whatever. If you miss 1 or 2 of them, you might only see the guy play once or twice a year. But you got, everybody watches the NFL playoffs, right? And you got to see him play 3 games in a row where he played out of his mind. And that's where a lot of people's perception of him it was formed. And that's where a lot of people's perception of him stopped, if you think about it. They didn't, it's like he had 3 great games. And after that, it's almost like it doesn't matter what's really happened since then. And what's happened since then is that those 3 games were probably the exception and not the rule for Devin White. Not saying he's not a good player, but I think he's overrated, meaning he would also be overpriced, meaning they would have to spend probably too much to actually trade for him to get him for what he's worth and what he's going to bring back.
Paul, given that, to different degrees, Devin White and Devin Bush have maybe not been the players people expected them to be when we were talking about them as top 10 picks a few years ago. I think it begs the question is, how hard is it going to be to find a do-everything linebacker as these running games get more advanced? I think we saw a lot of that in 2023 with the Eagles, I think, leading the way, but other teams ran the ball very effectively. And, our notions of this being a passing-only league, I think, might be changing a little bit, because teams are innovating in the running game, but they're also still passing a ton too. Is it just going to be hard to find the type of person, that Steelers fans want that can do everything in both the passing and running game?
Yeah, those players are tough because you got to be big enough and strong enough and physical enough at the point of attack to, be able to shed blocks or take on blocks and also make plays, and and stop the run. You also have to be nimble-feeted enough and quick enough and fast enough to cover slot receivers or tight ends. I mean, that's a tough combination to come by. And it's not a new thing either. Those kind of guys, they just don't exist. They're almost unicorns, players that are really, really good at not just stopping the run, but also in coverage. And so it's why you've started to see teams try and go to almost like this nickel or dime kind of package where you've got these hybrid safeties, right, that are out there that are maybe a little bigger than a normal safety, not quite as big as a linebacker. They're capable of making tackles, right? But more importantly, they're also capable of being in coverage. That is the prototype for what they're looking for. That's what they need. That's what NFL teams want. Linebackers that can run, that are also physical enough to make plays. So to me, even if you get a guy that grades well in running and athletic part of it, man, if they can't make plays at the point of attack, then what do you have basically is a situational third down guy. And so that's why teams were, are and were willing to take one of these inside linebacker freak types in the top 10 or 15. People can say, oh, well, there's other positions. Actually, that's a really important position. And the best ones, they're probably more rare than, even really good like left tackles, because that's a tough combination to find. A guy that's athletic enough and fast enough to cover, and also strong enough and physical enough and heavy enough to go into the box there, take on 300-pounders, shed them, and make tackles. I mean, good luck finding those kind of guys.
Paul, I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, talk about the Penguins and what happened Tuesday night at PPG Paints Arena. They were heavily favored to beat Chicago, basically lock up a playoff spot. Instead, they kind of got destroyed in the third period by a team that's honestly tanking to get Connor Bedard in the draft. There were fans chanting, "Fire Hextall, fire Hextall." A lot of sports media personalities like us, Paul, were on Twitter saying, "Nah, this one's on the players. They got to wear this one." Where do you fall on that question, Paul? Because I kind of look at it as, it's a bad team that Ron Hextall put together. You can't be surprised when things like this happen, and I think it does ultimately land at his feet, even if the players should have beaten, that team that was in front of them last night.
Well, I mean, I think it's two separate issues. Number one, Ron Hextall and his inability to build a good team is why they got into the last week of the season needing help in order to make the playoffs. Okay. So you're right. He put together a bad team. They weren't good enough. They clearly, given the fact that they got 82 games out of Crosby, 82 games out of Malkin, both were very productive. Chris Letang, who he's played about 64, 65 games, was very productive. The bottom line is, and even though they had some injury issues with their goalies, both of their NHL goalies combined to play about 75 or 76 games or something like that. In other words, injuries were not an issue for this team. And so at the end of the day, they should have been in like the 5th or 6th or 7th playoff spot 2 weeks ago. But they weren't, because they weren't good enough. Now, that's one issue. And that's where Ron Hextall has to wear it. However, I do agree that regardless of what you think about the season, the team put together, all the other stuff, if I would have told you you have to play the Blackhawks, who, by the way, half the guys that were on the ice the other night were guys that were playing in Rockford, Illinois a few days ago or a week ago, right? And Columbus. And all you got to do is win those 2 games and you get to the playoffs. At that point, if you don't do it, it's on the players and it's on Mike Sullivan. At that point, to me, losing NHL games is one thing. You didn't lose to an NHL team the last night. You lost to a team that wears an NHL jersey, wears NHL jerseys, had a couple of players that were obviously still reasonably good players in the NHL, but for the most part, they packed it in a long time ago. They had a bunch of AHL guys out there, and any goalie can get hot any night, but come on, man, they had lost 11 out of 12 games. They weren't even trying to win anymore. So to me, that is on Mike Sullivan. That is on the players. That is on Tristan Jarry. Losing that game, one game, I will put it on that. But as far as why they're where they're at, it's on Ron Hextall. And to me, it never made sense to hire Ron Hextall, ever. Here's why. Not because he's a Philadelphia Flyer or whatever the hell the storyline is. I don't care about that, right? I mean, we've seen Pitt people take jobs at Penn State people take jobs at Pitt. It works out. It's fine, right? It's not about stuff like that. It's about what the Penguins needed when Jim Rutherford stepped down. The first thing they decided, clearly, was that they were not going to rebuild. They were not going to go into a full rebuild. They were going to just stick with the main guys they had. They were going to stick with, Crosby and Malkin and Letang, the trio, whatever you want to call it. They were going to move forward, and they were going to try and get as many runs out of that group as they can. Well, if that's the case, why did you hire a general manager whose specialty is tearing it down and building it up with prospects? Who's known as a very conservative guy when it comes to trades, who's not looked at as very like forward thinking and bold when it comes to building a roster. Why would you hire that guy to take on this team when you were never going to be in that mode? When you needed somebody that was going to be bold, when you needed somebody that was going to be aggressive, when you needed somebody who was going to say, you know what, whatever prospects or picks we have left in our system, if we have to empty them to get the right people around our 3 stars to give them 1 or 2 or 3 more runs, we're going to do it, right? Somebody like, dare I say, Jim Rutherford. At the end of the day, Ron Hextall was never a fit here. He was never a good fit here. His style, his philosophy, his the way that he feels like you have to build a team, none of it fit where the Penguins were in this particular point of time when he was hired, because they were a team that still had old, aging, whatever you're going to call them, stars that still had really good years in them, right? And they were going to come hell or high water, they were going to build a team around those to try and extend and get as many runs, just sort of like the Steelers did at the end of Ben Roethlisberger's career. I had said that last 3-year deal or whatever it was that he signed, I said they shouldn't sign him. They should, trade him, move on from him, start the rebuild process. They made the decision they were going to try and take as many runs as they could with Ben as long as he was playing, which is why they made some of the decisions they made, right? That were kind of like here and now decisions. I said the same thing about the Penguins. When they made the decision that they were not going to fire or they were not going to move on from Malkin and Letang, guess what? You've now committed to, we're going to try and take as many runs at it as we can. And if that's the case, why hire Ron Hextall, whose philosophy, whose specialty is, I'm going to take a team that has no talent, right? I'm going to try and parlay it into having prospects, and we're going to build that way. We're not going to take many chances. We don't have to be bold. We don't have to go all in and everything else. We're going to take it a little bit of a time and a step at a time. That philosophy doesn't come together with what the Penguins needed when he was hired.
Paul, you mentioned Mike Sullivan and how that game Tuesday night was partly on him. There's been some talk on Twitter and social media of, is it time to move on from Mike Sullivan as well? Where do you land on that question? And is it a matter of, if they do move on from Ron Hextall and they get another general manager, do you give Mike Sullivan another year to prove that he can mesh with the new GM and a GM who might be able to find players who can better fit the system that Mike Sullivan wants to play? Or do you say, hey, like at this point in Crosby, Malcolm, Letang's career, you need a coach who's willing to adapt and say, we're not only going to play one way, and we're not going to play like it's 2016, 2017. We're going to adapt our tactics to the guys we have in the room and not just the guys we wish we had in the room.
I clean house. I do. I might give Mike Sullivan, I sit him down, say, listen, if the next general manager wants to retain you, I'll listen. I want changes to your coaching staff, right? I mean, I think it's very clear that they're coaching. At the very least, you got to do that. But if the next general manager says he wants his own guy, I'm going to let him go get his own guy. So if you want to talk about buying, a buyout situation where we figure out how to get out of this deal, let's do it. But you will start next season on a hot seat. I've said, listen, there are people, here's the thing. There are people that are trying to make it, this comparison between him and Tomlin. I've said the same thing about Tomlin. At some point, guess what? I mean, if I'm going to make a difference or a comparison, because, of course, there are some people that try and bring it up and, they try and bring up the race stuff as the right, oh, well, they're harder on Mike Tomlin. Let's come back to earth. Mike Sullivan won 2 championships, not just one. And his 2 championships were within the last 7 years or whatever. Mike Tomlin only won one championship, and it was 15 years ago. What? 2008. Am I right about that, or am I wrong? I think I'm right? Or 2008?
You're right.
Right? 15 years ago. It's a different situation. But hockey's a different sport as well. And in hockey, it's very clear. Players get antsy with the same voice. Hockey coaches that last a long time are a rarity. And I think Mike Sullivan's biggest problem is he's stubborn. A, stubborn's a good word. B, he's married to his system, right? And C, he's not going to be told how to do anything because I won 2 Stanley Cups doing things my way. It's hard when you've won and had a high level of success to allow people to come in then and basically tell you, well, you got to do some things differently, right? It's hard for these guys. But that being said, I would say the entire front office needs to be cleaned out, right? They need a new philosophy. It's stale. Whatever they've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years, it's stale. And I know Rutherford was there, but, for the most part, I just feel like it's a stale, kind of organization that's not moving forward in any direction, right? So I would do that, and I would tell Mike Sullivan, listen, I'll let the general manager make the call. But you need to know you're going to be on a really short leash next year. And we start out the season and we're 10-20 after 30 games or something. You know what? I'll be looking to make a change because my philosophy is I want to try and maximize the window of these stars. And now that we're committed to them for the next 2 years, right? The next 2 years, we can't make mistakes. We can't lose games because we blow leads because you won't alter your style after we get a 2-0 lead. You want to continue to do the things that you do that make it so that we are vulnerable to giving up goals late in games, which is a big, big problem, right? So, how many odd man rushes do you see them give up when you're up 2-0, 3-0? If you're playing hockey and it's the third period and you're up 2-0, 3-0, you should never give up a single odd man rush, right? But because of the things they do defensively and the way they push it and the way they pinch and the way they attack, guess what? They're vulnerable to it, and that's how they let these teams get back into it. So I would actually give Sullivan, I would tell him he could start next year, provided the next general manager's okay with it. But he's going to be on a reasonably short leash, and he probably needs to change his staff a little bit.
What about the situation in goal, Paul? I don't know what the Penguins do there. Obviously, Tristan Jarry is a major problem, but very often, the guys in free agency are all basically the same thing, right? Like you're not going to find, a can't-miss guy in free agency that doesn't come with his own set of problems. Is this just a case of maybe a change of scenery is best for everyone involved, whether it's Jarry, a new goalie, an old goalie, anything? It seems like such an untenable situation, but the solutions also are not so obvious, I feel like.
So you mean Vasilevsky is not going to be available to the Penguins in the offseason? Is that
I don't think.
What's the kid's name for the Rangers? What's his name? Igor
Shesterkin.
Shesterkin, yeah. One of those guys isn't available. Well, here's the thing. You got to move on from Tristan Jarry. You got to. You want to tell me that you're keeping Casey DeSmith around? You know what? He's a serviceable backup. I don't have a problem with him. You cannot have Tristan Jarry as your starting goalie next year. That has to be priority number one, right? There's some other things that need to happen. You need to, fix some of the things with your defensive pairings. Try and get a little bit more scoring punch in your bottom six. Maybe see if you can get one or two teams to take one of these bad contracts off of your hands somehow, and try and move some things around. But priority number one has to be goalie. Absolutely has to be goalie. Can't be any other area. Because at the end of the day, if you can't have a reliable, consistent goalie, you cannot win in the NHL, at least not at a high level, no matter how many goals you can score. That's the problem. And you know what? I said the same thing after last season, that they're not good enough in goal. And Tristan Jarry is a guy who has proven he's not reliable. And if he's not going to be reliable, he can't be your starting goalie. So either trade Casey DeSmith and bring in a veteran that is going, or actually last year I think they could have just moved on from Casey DeSmith or whatever. But either move on from Casey DeSmith and bring in a veteran that's capable of starting to complement Tristan Jarry, or move on from Jarry and go get a starting goalie and keep Casey DeSmith. They kept them both. So they got what they deserved, because you ended up with an unreliable guy who gets hurt a lot as your starter and a backup having to play the ball, far more games than you want your backup to play. Because as you know, a lot of times a backup is good in small sample sizes, but the more that they play, the more they get exposed and the more you say, oh, that's why they're a backup. So to me, they created their own mess by the way they mishandled goalies in the offseason.
Paul, would you have stayed for the post-game jersey off the back ceremony if you had won a Jan Ruta jersey? Would you have stayed, or would you gone home with your bucket hat?
I probably would have stayed. That's just me. If I was there, I probably would have stayed. Because at the end of the day, it's a cool little thing they do. It's pretty neat. It's the end of the season. It's your last time in the arena, especially now, that they lost. Had they won, you could say to yourself, well, I'll be back here next week in the playoffs. But, I think that there's a really good chance that the Islanders are going to beat the Canadiens and it's going to be over for the Penguins. And so I probably would have stayed, yes.
Yeah, just so you all know, we're recording this on Wednesday afternoon, so we don't know the result of that New York Islanders-Montreal game yet. But we're going to talk as if we do. And I feel like the energy is going in one direction, Paul.
Right.
Let's switch gears again and go to the Pirates, the team in town that is not actively letting people down at this point. Obviously, the Oneil Cruz situation has kind of changed things for this franchise. But I also feel like it hasn't changed them that much, Paul, because I don't think we ever expected this team to really contend for anything in 2023. And I think the thing we had to see beyond Oneil Cruz was some of these young guys step up and prove that they can be pieces of the future. Where are you with this team? Can this season still be a success if you have young players step up and prove that they can be parts of the future, even if the team doesn't win anything and keep winning at the rate that it has so far, where you're flirting with first place still going on 2 weeks into this?
Well, I mean, I think, losing Cruz hurts because Cruz is one of the, centerpieces, or one of the most important players for whether or not there's going to be a renaissance, right? And I think we all wanted to see, okay, what does his sophomore season look like? Is he going to be more disciplined at the plate? Is he going to hit more balls, that he misses? Is he going to, go to a 30 home run guy? Is he going to be a 30 home run, 20 stolen base guy? Is he going to, all of those things now, they're all out the window because we're not really going to see him until mid-August. And I'm assuming they're going to be extremely cautious with him, which means it won't shock me if they push that back even further, right? And so you're losing basically a whole year of a guy who's supposed to be one of your centerpiece, one of your cornerstone players. You're also losing a guy who, yes, he swings and misses a lot, but guess what? Every time he's at the plate, the other pitchers have to be aware and know they can't make a mistake. And when you have that guy in your lineup, it sort of makes it a little different for everyone else around. So they're losing a lot by losing him. That being said, I don't know that he was at the level yet where they were really going to be relying on him to be a steady, consistent batter, hitter. They wanted some power out of him. They wanted a little more consistency. But I don't know that it's going to change the projectile necessarily 100% of their offense. And quite frankly, they've got a lot of middle infielders in their system. So defensively, they could probably make up what they're losing with him as well. That's not to say he's not an important player, but it is to say that I think the Pirates, maybe there's going to be some other players that will step up. Maybe, like you said, there'll be some younger players that we'll get a chance to see that we wouldn't have seen, and we'll just have to see how it all plays out. But I think it's a tough blow for the Pirates, but I don't think it's, like this isn't 3 years from now, say they're, a team that we expect to maybe contend for the division, and Oneil Cruz is in year 4 or 5 and he's a bona fide superstar. that's a different situation than this is.
Yeah, I agree, Paul. What have you seen from these? Do you believe in this team and their ability, maybe not to make it all the way? Because I think you and I are both in the camp of they're not going to be contending for a playoff berth at the end of the season. But could we still be seeing them playing meaningful games in June and July? The comparison I've made is 2003 and 2011. 2011 was the year that they flirted with first place into July, and they contended, and we obviously knew that they weren't going to probably be there by the end, but they had a nice run of a few months. 2003, there was a bunch of veterans, and they just kind of plodded along, and they weren't terrible, but they weren't horrific either. Where do you think this team can be in 3 months now that Oneil Cruz is gone? Do you think they can play those meaningful games?
I think that, if they're into June and July and they're still contending, that should be, grounds to say it's been a really good season. Because you remember 11 and 12, right? 11 and 12. They were contending all the way into July and August or whatever, early August, late July, and then collapsed completely because, the depth and everything else. And here, look, if they're good into June, July, you know what's going to happen. Rich Hill, if he's serviceable, he'll get traded. Carlos Santana get traded. You know what I mean? A couple other guys that are veteran guys they picked up, probably if they're playing well, they'll get traded. And then all of a sudden, you're playing with a bunch of young guys, and probably that will have an effect. I said at the beginning of the year, I think they're a 74, 75 win team. Nothing I've seen changes that. Right? Nothing I've seen changes that. And if you're a 74, 75 year win team, for the most part, you're probably going to have stretches where you look really good and some stretches where you don't look so good. But you're going to have some good stretches where you win a lot of games. So that's kind of what I expect from this team.
Paul, what's it going to take for you to trust Mitch Keller? I think he's looked really good so far. I think he looked really good in the second half last year. But then obviously we remember most of his career, he was the type of guy who'd go out and pitch well in one game and blow up in the next. And his ERA would settle somewhere in the 5s and 6s, and that's not good enough. Do you trust him yet as maybe not like – I think we talked about this last week, maybe not the ace of the staff, not a guy who's going to go up and pitch to a 2 ERA and flirt with Jacob deGrom and Cy Young area, but some guy who can be a consistent member of your rotation. Do you see that from him?
I think if you change your expectations of him, right, from like staff ace to really solid 2 or 3, yeah, I trust him to be that. I think more often than not, he'll go to the mound and he'll give them a really good chance to win and he'll give them a pretty good outing. But you also know that you're going to live with every so often the blow up where he looks bad again, just because that's who he is. I think that if you have the right expectations for him, which I do now. A couple of years ago, I was trying to, like everybody else, convince myself that he was something he isn't. Now that we've seen him and we see what he has, I think he can be a really good, solid, consistent, middle-of-the-rotation kind of guy, maybe even as high as your number 2, and give you a really good chance to win almost every time he takes the mound. I feel like that's what he is, and that's what he's going to become. I think that's what we can expect from him. So to answer your question, yeah, I kind of trust him now.
If the Brian Reynolds, ship has sailed, and now I think you're in kind of a limbo category with Oneil Cruz now that he's injured and probably going to miss most of the season. Is Keller the next guy in line that you think about giving an extension to? Is he too old? Has he not been consistent enough? Where do you land on what the future with him should be? Because he's getting to the point, Paul, even though it doesn't feel like it should, he's in that same category as Brian Reynolds. It's a guy who's got a few years left, but if he's not going to be around for the long haul, you wonder what the next step with him is.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would basically say this. I would probably look to trade him because I don't know that, they don't have a ton of pitching depth, but they've got some good young pitchers coming up. The other part of it is I think you can always find somebody that can do what Mitch Keller will do for you. I don't know that he's special. I don't know that, those sort of really middle of the rotation kind of guys. I don't know that they're necessarily that hard to find. where you could find better options, cheaper. I think there's other guys you want to sign long term. There's other places you want to spend your money. But by the same token, if you feel like he's the guy that you think he is, and you can get him at a reasonable price for a couple of extra years of control, it might not be the worst idea to do. I personally probably wouldn't do it. I just don't know that he's that kind of guy that really merits that. But I actually wouldn't. I also wouldn't hate it if they did it.
Paul, wanted to wrap up the show with something you brought up. Is there's a lot of guys in the college basketball ranks choosing to stick around for another year rather than go pro. The big name is Filipowski from Duke. I think he surprised a lot of people by coming back. Obviously, NIL is probably an element of that, and the ability to earn while in school, as opposed to just basically giving the colleges an extra year of being able to use you for your services. Paul, is this kind of a sea change, and are we going to see more guys, especially those one and done guys, say, I'm going to take another year in college. I'm really going to improve my stock. I'm going to try to win something, try to put my name on a trophy and identify myself with a school. Because there is some value in that, Paul, right? Winning a national championship and having a connection with Duke and being one of their all-time great players. There's value in that regardless of what happens at the next level, right?
Here's the other thing. I'm going to let you in a little secret. College basketball and college life is fun. The NBA is a job. The NBA is you're starting your life. You're starting your career. And you're going to be hanging around a bunch of guys who are 35 years old and have families and everything else. And you're going to be doing nothing but basketball day after day after day after day. College life is fun, Adam. You were in college. That's the thing that I think most people miss about all of this stuff. Is that a lot of these guys, these one and done guys, they went for the money and they, made sense and they needed to. Most of them, if you really ask them, would tell you, you know what? It wasn't bad having 3 meals a day and training table and have everything taken care of. And, I'm hanging around the campus where there's, say 20,000 students. That means there's 10,000 chicks. You know what I mean? Like at the end of the day, I'm a big man on campus, right? I go to parties, I hang out, I have no responsibilities. That's fun. That's what college basketball and college football provides for these guys. When he goes to the NBA, yeah, he'll make a lot of money and he'll join the subculture of NBA players. But guess what? Many of them are 30 years old, 28, 29, 30, 35 years old. They have families. It's a job, right? You're no longer a big man on campus. You don't, get to go chase females around at parties and, all the other stuff you do. And you've got lots of responsibilities now. So NIL, for all of the talk of, how bad it is for football and I mean, for college sports, the one thing it is doing is allowing college basketball players the choice. Now, I could stay here and have fun for another year and still make a reasonable amount of money and then put my NBA career off by a year. And here's what I'm telling you. I just looked at the slotting for last year because I wrote something about this on Twitter. I looked at the slotting for last year. NBA first round pick to the 10th round, first round pick to the 10th pick. So the first 10 picks of the draft made from 11 million down to 5 million. Okay? Those are big numbers. But once you get past 10, it gets really quickly into the 3.5 to 2.5 to 2 range for the rest of the first round. I got to believe that Filipowski is going to get more than 2. He's going to get at least $2.5 million in his NIL deals at Duke. I have to believe, given what we know about the top guys and what they're making, right? I know Oscar Tshiebwe or whatever his name is from Kentucky got $2 million last year from Kentucky. At the end of the day, stay in college, be able to live college lifestyle for one more year, make $2.2 million or whatever, go to the NBA. It's a job. I'm a pro. Life, adult life really begins. I make $3 million. For $800,000, guess what? I'm going to stay in school because I don't have any expenses, by the way, staying in school. So I can do what I want to do anyway. And if I'm who I think I am, that money's going to be there for me next year. So in other words, you're not choosing between $3 million and nothing, right? $3 million in the buffet at the training table. That's not what you're choosing. Now you're choosing between, say, $3 million and $2.2 or $2.4 million. It's actually a choice for these guys, which is why I think you'll start to see some of these guys. And Duke's point guard made the same decision as well, by the way. Two of their guys are back. I saw one guy, I think from Alabama, one of these other places. He's coming back. I'm telling you, it's going to be a little bit of not a trend, but a mini trend where you start to see some of these guys who are, lottery picks or they're projected as first round picks start to really wait a minute. I can get this by staying in college. Maybe I'll stay here for another year and enjoy college life.
Yeah, I think that's going to be interesting to watch. Paul, is anything else on your mind this week that you wanted to touch on before we sign off here?
No, that's pretty much it, man. I think we've got it all in pretty good.
Absolutely. Well, we'll be back next week with Paul. Of course, stay tuned to the North Shore Drive this week as well. Christopher Carter. He's had all kinds of guests. We'll also have our mock draft tracker video on Saturday. So make sure you're signed up, subscribe to the channel for that. Otherwise, we will talk to you all again soon.
All right. We'll see you.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you liked the video, please like it and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed it on Apple Podcasts, please rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down in the description.